The morning sun peeked through the blinds of the Main Street diner, casting warm stripes of light across the checkered floor. It was just past 7, and the smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air. The cook flipped pancakes with practiced ease while waitresses hustled between tables, balancing plates and refilling mugs. This diner wasn't fancy, just a small-town Texas establishment where everybody knew everybody, and the regulars had their own spots worn into the vinyl seats. Frank Wilson pushed open the glass door, the little bell above it announcing his arrival. At 80 years old, Frank moved a bit slower these days, but he still stood tall and proud. His weathered hands gripped a wooden cane, not because he couldn't walk without it, but because his doctor insisted after his knee surgery last winter. As always, Frank wore his Korean War veteran's cap, the fabric faded but the pins gleaming. He'd polished them just yesterday like he did every week. "Morning, Frank," called Betsy, the head waitress who'd been serving him breakfast for nearly 15 years. "The usual?" Frank smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "You know it, Betsy, black coffee. And wheat toast, no butter," she finished with a wink. "Coming right up." Frank nodded and began making his way to his regular booth in the corner. The morning crowd was thin, just a couple of truckers at the counter, the high school principal, grabbing coffee before the morning bell, and a few retirees discussing yesterday's baseball game. Frank didn't notice the stranger in the leather vest sitting at a table near the middle of the diner, his muscular arms covered in tattoos and his face set in a scowl. The biker had parked his rumbling Harley outside about 20 minutes earlier. The staff had already figured out he wasn't from around here. He'd ordered his eggs over easy and sent them back twice, complaining they weren't right. His coffee mug sat empty, but he'd snapped at Betsy when she tried to refill it. The kitchen staff had whispered that his bike was making strange noises when he pulled up, probably why he was in such a foul mood. As Frank shuffled past the stranger's table, his cane caught on the leg of a chair. Frank stumbled slightly, bumping the edge of the biker's table. The man's coffee mug rattled, spilling a few drops onto the table. "I'm sorry about that," Frank said sincerely, steadying himself. "These old legs ain't what they used to be." The biker looked up, his eyes narrowing. His name was Ray, though nobody in the diner knew that yet. What they could see was the storm brewing on his face, the kind of anger that doesn't match the situation. "Watch where you're going," Ray snarled, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape against the floor. Frank blinked, surprised by the hostility. "No harm done, son. I didn't mean to disturb your breakfast." Something about Frank's calm demeanor seemed to irritate Ray even more. He stood up, towering over the elderly man. The diner grew quiet. Even the sizzling from the grill seemed to fade as everyone turned to watch. "I ain't your son," Ray said, his voice rising. "And I don't need some old man making excuses." Frank's expression changed from surprise to a dignified calm. He straightened his back as much as his aged spine would allow and gestured to his veteran's cap. "I fought so folks like you could enjoy their breakfast in peace," he said quietly. "No need for trouble here." The mention of Frank's service was the match that lit the powder keg of Ray's temper. Later, people would wonder what made the biker so angry. Was it trouble with the law, money problems, or just a mean streak? Whatever the reason, what happened next shocked everyone in the diner. "I don't care who you fought for," Ray growled, and without warning he shoved Frank hard in the chest. Time seemed to slow down as Frank stumbled backward. His cane clattered to the floor as he fell against a nearby table, knocking over a glass of orange juice. His veteran's cap slipped off, landing beside a booth. For a moment, the only sound was the splash of juice dripping onto the tile. Then, everything happened at once. Betsy rushed forward, her phone already in her hand, recording. The cook emerged from the kitchen, spatula in hand like a weapon. Two truckers stood up from their stools at the counter, their faces dark with anger. "Hey!" one of them shouted, but Ray wasn't listening. The biker threw some crumpled bills on his table and grabbed his leather jacket. "That's what happens when you don't watch where you're walking," he muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "No." One stopped him as he stormed out, partly from shock, partly because their first concern was Frank. The old veteran was already trying to stand, waving off help despite the orange juice staining his shirt. I'm fine," he insisted as Betsy and another customer helped him to his feet. Someone retrieved his cap and cane. "Should we call the police?" asked the diner owner who had emerged from the back office. Frank shook his head. "No need to make a fuss. I've taken worse hits from artillery," but Betsy wasn't having it. She held up her phone, her hands trembling slightly with anger. "I got it all on video. That's not right what he did to you, Frank." "Send it to me," said the high school principal, her face grim. "My nephew works at the local news station." As Frank settled into his booth, finally accepting the ice pack Betsy brought for his bruised elbow, he didn't know that the video was already being shared in local community groups. He didn't know that by the time his toast arrived, people across town were watching him get shoved by a stranger. He certainly didn't know that within the hour, the footage would reach someone who took disrespect to veterans very personally. Outside, the rumble of Ray's motorcycle grew fainter as he headed toward the edge of town, unaware that his bad decision was about to catch up with him in a way he never expected. And he definitely didn't know that Chuck Norris, who was attending a veterans' charity event just 30 miles away, was about to see exactly what had happened in that small-town diner. Betsy's hands were still shaking as she watched Frank eat his toast. The old veteran insisted he was fine, but she noticed how carefully he moved his right arm. She glanced down at her phone, the video she'd captured already uploaded to the local community Facebook page called Heart of Texas Neighbors. She'd added a simple caption. "This happened at Main Street Diner this morning. Our beloved Mr. Wilson, Korean War vet, shoved by an out-of-town biker. Please share so someone recognizes this man." Outside the diner's windows, normal small-town life continued. The mail carrier pushed his cart down the sidewalk, waving at familiar faces. A school bus rumbled past, running late as usual. None of them knew that inside Betsy's phone a digital storm was brewing. By the time Frank finished his coffee, Betsy's post had been shared 87 times. Comments poured in. "That's Frank Wilson. He taught history at the high school for 30 years. My grandpa served with Frank in Korea. This is disgusting. I think I've seen that biker at the gas station on Route 16. Tom Peterson, who ran the hardware store across the street, burst through the diner door, phone in hand. "Betsy, your video's everywhere. My daughter in Houston just called about it." Frank looked up confused. "What's all the fuss about? I've taken harder hits playing horseshoes." But the fuss was just beginning. Betsy's sister worked as a secretary at the local news station, KTXS 12. When she saw the video during her coffee break, she immediately walked it into the news director's office. 20 minutes later, a young reporter and cameraman pushed through the diner door, making a beeline for Frank's booth. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Judy from Channel 12 News. Would you mind telling us what happened here this morning?" Frank blinked at the camera, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "It was nothing, really. Just a misunderstanding." But the other customers weren't having it. The trucker who'd stood up during the incident leaned into the frame. "It wasn't no misunderstanding. That punk deliberately shoved this American hero. I was going to step in, but it happened so fast." The cook emerged from the kitchen, still wearing his apron. "Frank comes in here every day. Never bothers nobody. That biker was trouble from the minute he walked in." The 5-minute interview stretched to 15 as more customers shared what they'd seen. All the while, Frank sat quietly, occasionally shaking his head at what he considered unnecessary drama. When the reporter asked if he wanted to press charges, Frank firmly declined. "That young man's got enough troubles, seems to me. Don't need to add to them." As the news crew packed up, promising the story would lead the noon broadcast, Frank finally stood to leave. Betsy refused to let him pay for his breakfast. "Your money's no good here today, Frank," she insisted, giving him a gentle hug. What none of them realized was how quickly the story was spreading beyond their small town. The local news station's social media manager had posted a teaser clip from Betsy's video with the headline, "Veteran Assaulted, Local Hero Shoved in Diner." Within the hour, a regional veterans group had picked it up, adding their own outraged comment. "This is how we treat those who served? Spread this until we identify the man responsible." By 11:30 a.m., less than 4 hours after the incident, the view count had climbed to over 100,000. A producer at a Dallas morning show spotted it, and added it to their rundown for the next day, planning to interview Frank via video call. But the story was about to take an unexpected turn. In a hotel restaurant 30 miles away, Chuck Norris was having a late breakfast with the organizers of a veterans charity event. The martial arts legend and actor had spent the morning signing autographs and taking photos with veterans, something he did regularly out of respect for those who served. At 84, Norris wasn't as spry as in his Walker, Texas Ranger days, but he still trained daily and stood straight as a board. One of the event coordinators, Bill, was scrolling through his phone between bites of scrambled eggs. Suddenly he stopped, chewing. "Chuck, you gotta see this," he said, passing his phone across the table. Norris put on his reading glasses and watched the video. The table fell silent as they all observed his reaction. First, his jaw tightened. Then, his eyes narrowed, slightly. Anyone who knew Chuck Norris recognized these subtle signs. He was angry. "Who is this veteran?" he asked quietly, handing the phone back. Bill scrolled through the comments. "Says here his name is Frank Wilson, Korean War vet from Oak Ridge. That's not far from here, maybe 30 minutes. Chuck Norris checked his watch. A simple, practical timepiece, not the flashy kind celebrities often wore. "When was this taken?" "Timestamp says 7:23 this morning." Norris nodded slowly, doing the math. "Not even 4 hours ago." He turned to his assistant, who sat nearby. "Jack, can you find out which diner this is and get the address?" The younger man nodded, already typing on his tablet. Norris turned back. "To the event organizers, I apologize, but I need to leave early. This can't wait." The lead organizer, a retired Army colonel, nodded immediately. "Of course, Chuck, we understand completely." As Norris stood, he took one more look at the freeze frame of the video. Frank Wilson's veteran cap on the floor, the old man stumbling against a table. His decision was made. Jack, call the driver and find out where this Frank Wilson lives. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled away from the hotel. Inside, Chuck Norris sat silently, scrolling through the comments on the viral video. One caught his attention. Someone had identified the biker's motorcycle as having out-of-state plates with a distinctive sticker from a motorcycle club. Another commenter mentioned the bike was making strange noises, like it needed repair. "Jack," Norris said to his assistant, "when we get to town, let's check the local repair shops. If his bike was having trouble, he might have stopped for help." As the SUV merged onto the highway, neither Chuck Norris nor his team realized just how quickly they would find themselves face to face with the man from the video. And that man had absolutely no idea what was coming his way. Not just an aging action star, but a force of nature dedicated to respecting those who had served their country. Behind them, the view count on Betsy's video crossed 150,000 and continued to climb. Ray pulled his motorcycle into Johnson's Auto Repair on the edge of town, the engine making a concerning rattling sound that had gotten worse over the last 10 miles. The place wasn't much to look at, a weathered brick building with 2 garage bays, an office with cloudy windows, and a small waiting area that smelled like old coffee and motor oil. A hand-painted sign promised, "Honest work at honest prices." He cut the engine, the sudden silence highlighting the tension in his shoulders. The morning's events at the diner still buzzed in his head like angry wasps. Ray wasn't proud of what he'd done. Shoving an old man wasn't exactly his finest moment. But he'd been on edge for days now. His bike was acting up. He was low on cash. And the phone call from his sister last night about their dad hadn't helped. "Sounds like you've got trouble," a voice called out. The mechanic, a lean man in his 50s with grease-stained hands and a name patch that read, Pete, stepped out from one of the bays. "That's a timing chain about to give up the ghost if I had to guess." Ray nodded. "Can you fix it today? I need to be in Houston by tomorrow." Pete wiped his hands on a rag and circled the bike, his eyes taking in the model, the wear, and the out-of-state plates. "Might be able to. Got the parts in stock, I think." His tone was professional but noticeably cool. "Fill out this form. I'll take a closer look." As Ray started writing down his information, he didn't notice Pete step into the office and pick up his phone. He didn't see the mechanic looking at something on the screen, then glancing back at Ray with narrowed eyes. What Ray also didn't know was that Pete's daughter worked as a waitress at the Main Street diner. She wasn't on shift this morning, but she'd already texted her dad about the jerk on the Harley who shoved Mr. Wilson. Across town, the black SUV, carrying Chuck Norris, pulled up in front of Frank Wilson's house. A modest single-story home with American and Marine Corps flags flying from a pole in the neatly kept front yard. A stone path lined with flowers led to the front door, where a welcome friends mat waited. This should be it, Jack said, checking the address they'd gotten from the diner owner. Want me to go first? Chuck shook his head. I'll go. Despite being in his 80s, he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime training his body. Age had slowed him somewhat but hadn't diminished his presence, that undefinable quality that made people straighten their posture when he entered a room. Frank answered the door on the third knock, his eyes widening in disbelief at the visitor, standing on his porch. Mr. Wilson? Chuck Norris extended his hand. I'm Chuck Norris. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. Frank blinked several times, then broke into a grin. Well, I'll be Chuck Norris on my doorstep. Either I hit my head harder than I thought at the diner, or this is the strangest day of my life. He shook Norris's hand firmly. Please come in. And it's just Frank. The inside of Frank's home was tidy and modest, with furniture that had been well cared for over decades rather than replaced. Photos lined the walls. Frank in his Marine uniform, Frank with his late wife on their wedding day, Frank surrounded by students from his teaching days. A bookshelf filled with history books stood in one corner. A half-finished model airplane sat on a small desk by the window. Can I get you some coffee? Frank offered, still seeming amazed by his unexpected guest. That would be great, thank you. As Frank busied himself in the kitchen, Norris studied the photos more closely. One showed a much younger Frank with his unit in Korea, standing beside a tank in the snow. Another showed him receiving a Purple Heart. Frozen chosen, Frank said, returning with 2 mugs. He nodded toward the Korea photo. Reservoir campaign, winter of 1950, coldest I've ever been in my life. Chuck accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. I've met many veterans from that battle. Tough men, every one of them. Frank settled into his recliner, gesturing for Chuck to take the sofa. Now, I suspect you're not here because you were driving by and decided to visit a stranger. This about what happened at the diner? It is, Chuck confirmed. I saw the video. I was in town for a veterans event. Frank sighed. Whole thing's been blown way out of proportion. That young man was having a bad day, that's all. We all have. Them. Bad day or not, he put his hands on a veteran, on a man who served his country with honor. There was no anger in Chuck's voice, just a calm certainty. That doesn't sit right with me. Frank studied Chuck over the rim of his coffee mug. What exactly are you planning to do? I'd like to have a word with him, man to man. Chuck's expression softened slightly. But first I wanted to check on you. Are you really all right? Frank chuckled. Takes more than a shove to keep an old Marine down. I've got a bruise on my elbow and my pride's a bit dented, but I'm fine. He paused, considering. You know, there's something about that young man. Reminded me of my brother when he came back from Vietnam. All anger. No place to put it. Chuck nodded thoughtfully. I've seen that look before, too. They talked for nearly half an hour about service, about the changing world, about what it meant to be a man of honor in times when such things seemed old-fashioned. Despite the age gap between them, they found common ground easily. Finally, Frank asked the question that had been on his mind. So how do you plan to find this fella? Town's not big, but he's probably long gone by now. Chuck smiled slightly. His motorcycle was making noise. Bad timing chain from what people said in the video comments. There aren't many repair shops around here. Frank's eyebrows rose. Pete's Place, Johnson's Auto Repair, only decent bike mechanic within 30 miles. That's what I figured. Chuck stood, setting his empty mug on the coffee table. Would you like to come along? Frank considered this for a moment, then shook his head. I think this is between you and him. But if you don't mind, I'd appreciate knowing how it turns out. You have my word, Chuck promised, extending his hand. Again. As they shook, Frank added, "Just don't be too hard on him. Sometimes a man needs a chance to make things right more than he needs a lesson." Chuck nodded, taking the older man's wisdom to heart. "I'll remember that." Back at Johnson's Auto Repair, Pete had confirmed Ray's fears. The timing chain was shot and the repair would take at least 2 hours. Ray sat in the small waiting area, scrolling through his phone, unaware that his face was now appearing on screens across the state. He was equally unaware that Pete had made a quick call to his daughter, who had called Betsy at the diner, who had posted an update to the community page. "Biker who shoved Mr. Wilson is at Johnson's repair shop right now," and he certainly had no idea that a black SUV was pulling into the gravel lot outside, or that Chuck Norris was about to walk through the door, bringing with him a reckoning that had nothing to do with fists and everything to do with respect. Pete glanced through the office window, recognition dawning on his face as he saw who was approaching his shop. He whispered to himself, "Well, I'll be damned." The bell above the door of Johnson's Auto Repair jingled as Chuck Norris stepped inside. The waiting area fell completely silent. A woman with a toddler on her lap stopped mid-sentence, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her mouth. The teenage boy reading a motorcycle magazine looked up, then nudged his friend and whispered something that made them both stare wide-eyed. Pete wiped his hands on a shop rag and stepped out from behind the counter, his usual customer greeting dying on his lips. It's not every day a legend walks into your repair shop in a small Texas town. "Mr. Norris," Pete said finally, extending his hand. "Pete Johnson. My shop. This is something." Chuck shook his hand firmly. "Afternoon, Pete. I'm looking for someone who might be getting his motorcycle fixed." Pete's eyes flickered toward the corner of the waiting area, where Ray sat scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the newcomer. He'd put in earbuds and was watching something on his screen, his back to the door. "Think I might be able to help you with that," Pete said quietly. He led Chuck toward the counter, lowering his voice. "That's him in the corner. Timing chain. On his Harley. Should be done in about an hour." Chuck nodded his thanks. Jack, his assistant, positioned himself near the door, making sure the situation stayed private. The other customers, sensing something important was happening, found reasons to step outside or move to the far side of the waiting area. Ray finally looked up when a shadow fell across his phone. He pulled out an earbud, irritation crossing his face at the interruption. Then his expression changed completely as recognition dawned. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "Mind if I join you?" Chuck asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside Ray. Ray nodded automatically, still staring. The instinct to stand in the presence of someone famous battled with the shock of finding himself face-to-face with Chuck Norris in a small-town repair shop. You're Chuck Norris," Ray finally managed, stating the obvious in the way people do when confronted with something unexpected. "I am," Chuck agreed, sitting down with the ease of a man comfortable in his own skin. "And you're the man who shoved an 80-year-old Korean War veteran at the Main Street diner this morning." The color drained from Ray's face. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to Chuck. "How did you?" "It's on video," Chuck said calmly. Being shared all over the state by now. Frank Wilson, Purple Heart recipient, served at the Chosin Reservoir, taught high school history here for 3 decades after he came home. Ray swallowed hard. "Look, I didn't know who he was. I was having a bad morning and—" "You didn't know who he was," Chuck repeated, his voice still conversational but carrying an unmistakable weight. "That's part of the problem, isn't it? When you look at an older man wearing a veteran's cap, you should see someone who's earned your respect before you even know his name." Ray looked down at his hands. The defensive anger that had been building deflated, leaving only shame in its place. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I messed up." Chuck studied him for a moment. Despite his reputation in movies, Chuck Norris had never been the shoot first, ask questions later type in real life. He believed in reading people, in understanding what drove them. And something about Ray's slumped shoulders told him there was more to this story. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" Chuck asked, his tone softening slightly. Ray rubbed his palm across his stubbled jaw. My dad died 3 days ago, he said finally. He was a vet too. Vietnam. We didn't talk much. A lot of bad water under that bridge. He paused, gathering himself. I was on my way to Houston to handle the funeral arrangements when my bike started acting up. Chuck nodded, letting him continue. Dad and I fought the last time we spoke. About nothing important, just the same old stuff. He wanted me to make something of myself, said I was wasting my life working at a bar and riding around on my damn motorcycle all the time. Ray's voice caught. Now he's gone, and I can't fix it. Can't tell him I was finally looking at going back to school. Maybe getting that engineering degree he always wanted for me. A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, the sounds of the repair shop continued. The clank of tools, the hiss of an air compressor, Pete's voice giving instructions to his apprentice. Grief doesn't excuse what you did, Chuck said finally, but it helps explain it. Ray nodded, accepting this. I know. I should go back and apologize to the old man, to Mr. Wilson. He corrected himself, the respect now evident in his voice. You should, Chuck agreed. But there's something else you need to understand. Veterans like Frank, like your father, they didn't just serve during wartime. They carried those experiences with them every day since. The nightmares, the memories, the friends they lost. They don't wear those caps for attention or praise. They wear them because those experiences shaped who they are. Ray listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in a long while. My father never talked about Vietnam, he said. Not once. I used to think he was just being difficult, not letting me in, but maybe he was protecting me from it. Very likely, Chuck said. Many don't talk about what they saw, doesn't mean they're not carrying it. Ray was quiet for a moment, processing this. So what happens now? Are the police waiting outside or something? There was resignation in his voice, not defiance. Chuck shook his head. Frank refused to press charges, said you were having a bad day. That's the kind of man he is. Ray's eyes widened slightly. He said that? After what I did? He did. Now I came here ready to give you a piece of my mind, maybe scare some sense into you. A slight smile crossed Chuck's face. I've got some experience with that. For the first time, Ray managed a small, nervous laugh. Yeah, I've seen your movies. But after talking with Frank, I think there's a better way. Chuck continued. 2 ways, actually. Ray straightened in his chair. I'm listening. First, you apologize to Frank. In person, not just online or through someone else. A real apology, man to man. Ray nodded immediately. I will, as soon as my bike's ready. Second, Chuck continued, the VA hospital in town needs volunteers. Veterans from several wars are there. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Some don't get many visitors. Some need someone to talk to or just sit with them while they watch a ball game. Ray's brow furrowed in confusion. You want me to volunteer? At the VA hospital for how long? That's up to you, Chuck said. But I think you might find some answers there. About your father, maybe about yourself. At the very least, you'll gain some understanding of what these men and women have given for this country. He paused. Your father might be gone, but there are others from his generation who could use someone to listen to their stories. The repair shop had gone unusually quiet. Pete was pretending to focus on paperwork at the counter, but he wasn't turning pages. The other customers had stopped their conversations, sensing the importance of what was happening in the corner. Ray was silent for a long moment. Then he squared his shoulders and met Chuck Norris's gaze directly. Okay, he said. I'll do both. You have my word. Chuck studied his face, looking for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded and extended his hand. Good man. They shook, the action somehow more meaningful than usual. A pact between them, witnessed only by the curious onlookers in a small-town repair shop. As they were finishing their conversation, Pete approached cautiously. Mr. Donovan, your bike's ready a bit earlier than expected. One of my guys put a rush on it. Ray stood, reaching for his wallet. How much do I owe you? Pete glanced at Chuck, then back to Ray. It's taken care of. What? No, I can't accept. Wasn't me, Pete said, holding up his hands. Call came in about 20 minutes ago. Anonymous. Said they wanted to pay for your repairs, whatever they were. Ray looked bewildered. Chuck just smiled. Small towns have their own way of handling things. Looks like someone's giving you a chance to start fresh. As they walked out to the parking lot, Ray's repaired motorcycle gleaming in the afternoon. Son, Chuck handed him a business card. My personal number, he explained. I'd like to know how things go with Frank and at the VA. Ray stared at the card in disbelief. Thank you. You could have really. Sometimes the hardest fights are the ones we have with ourselves, Chuck said. Seems to me you've been fighting that one for a while now. Maybe it's time to call a truce. As Ray carefully tucked the card into his wallet. Neither man noticed the small crowd that had gathered across the street or the phones discreetly taking pictures. By evening, the story of Chuck Norris confronting the biker would be all over social media, but the actual words exchanged would remain private, known only to the two men who shared them. What people would see, though, was something unexpected. Chuck Norris and Ray shaking hands in the parking lot before parting ways. And that image would spark almost as much discussion as the original video of the morning's events. The town's Veterans Memorial stood in the center of the small park across from the courthouse, a simple granite stone with an eternal flame and the names of local men and women who had served in America's wars. On this crisp morning, a small crowd had gathered there, drawn by a notice in the local paper and a flurry of social media posts about a special ceremony. Frank Wilson stood near the memorial, looking uncomfortable in his dress blues, the Marine uniform he hadn't worn in decades but still kept perfectly pressed in his closet. The medals on his chest caught the morning sunlight. His back was straight despite his years, his white hair neatly combed under his cover. Nearby, Mayor Thompson checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The local newspaper reporter adjusted her camera. Several veterans from the VFW post stood in a loose group, talking quietly among themselves. A few curious townspeople lingered at the edges of the gathering, drawn by the presence of Chuck Norris, who stood quietly beside Frank. You sure about this? Frank asked Chuck quietly. Seems like an awful lot of fuss. Chuck smiled slightly. It wasn't my idea. Ray called me yesterday after he spoke with you. Said he wanted to make it right, not just in private. Frank nodded, though he still looked uncomfortable with the attention. Boy seemed genuinely sorry when he came by the house. Didn't need to do all this. Sometimes a public mistake needs a public apology, Chuck replied. Gives everyone a chance to heal. The sound of a motorcycle engine cut through their conversation. Heads turned as Ray pulled up to the curb, his Harley gleaming in the morning light. He was almost unrecognizable from the angry man at the diner 3 days ago. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved. He wore clean jeans, polished boots, and a leather jacket with no club insignia, just a small American flag pin on the lapel. Ray parked his bike and walked toward the gathering, carrying a small box under his arm. His steps were steady, but his face showed his nervousness. This wasn't a man used to public speaking, much less public apologies. Mayor Thompson moved to the small podium that had been set up near the memorial. Folks, thank you all for coming this morning. As you know, our town experienced an unfortunate incident a few days ago. He gestured toward Frank. One of our most respected citizens, a decorated Korean War veteran, was disrespected in a way that shocked our community. Ray stood at the edge of the gathering, waiting for his cue. The mayor continued. But today isn't about dwelling on mistakes. It's about making things right. And it's about remembering why we honor those who served. The mayor nodded to Ray, who stepped forward. The crowd parted silently to let him through. Several people who had been at the diner that morning watched with wary expressions. Betsy from the diner stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Ray reached the podium, placing his box carefully on the ground beside him. He looked out at the faces watching him. Some curious, some still angry, all waiting to hear what he had to say. My name is Ray Donovan, he began, his voice rough with emotion. 3 days ago I did something I'm deeply ashamed of. I shoved Mr. Frank Wilson at the Main Street diner. He paused, gathering himself. There's no excuse for what I did. None. I was angry and hurting because of personal problems. But that doesn't justify taking it out on anyone, especially not a man who served our country with honor. Ray turned slightly to face Frank directly. Mr. Wilson, I apologize from the bottom of my heart, not just for shoving you, but for the disrespect I showed to you and to your service. My father was a Vietnam veteran. He raised me better than how I acted that day. Frank nodded his acceptance, his expression softening. Ray turned back to the crowd. My father passed away recently. We had a difficult relationship. He never talked about his time in Vietnam, and I never really understood what he went through. He paused, emotion making his voice catch. Thanks to Mr. Chuck Norris, who found me instead of letting me run from my mistake, I've spent the last 2 days volunteering at the VA hospital here in town. A murmur went through the crowd at this revelation. I've sat with men who served in the same war as my father. Men who could tell me what he might have experienced, why he might have been the way he was. For the first time, I'm beginning to understand. Ray's eyes glistened with unshed tears. One gentleman there, Mr. Howard, fought in the same area where my dad was stationed. He shared stories that helped me see my father in a new light. Ray bent down and picked up the box he had brought. My dad left me his service medals in his will. I never understood what they meant to him until now. He opened the box to reveal several military decorations. With Mr. Wilson's permission, I'd like to make a donation to the Veterans Memorial Fund in my father's name today. The mayor stepped forward, accepting an envelope from Ray. Thank you, son. Every donation helps us maintain this memorial and support programs for our local veterans. Ray turned once more to Frank. Sir, I can never undo what I did, but I promise you, the lesson I've learned will stay with me for the rest of my life. Every veteran I meet from now on will get the respect they deserve. Frank stepped forward, then extending his hand. Apology accepted, son. As they shook hands, the crowd broke into applause. Chuck Norris watched from the sidelines, a small smile on his face. This was the outcome he had hoped for. Not just an apology, but a genuine change of heart. After the ceremony, people lingered in small groups, talking. The tension that had hung over the town since the incident had lifted. Pete from the repair shop clapped Ray on the shoulder as he passed by. Betsy from the diner approached hesitantly. That took guts, she admitted. Standing up in front of everyone like that. Ray nodded. Hardest thing I've ever done. But necessary. Coffee's on the house next time you're at the diner, she offered. Though you might want to give it a few more days. Some folks have longer memories than others. I understand, Ray said. Thank you. As the crowd thinned, Chuck Norris approached Ray and Frank, who were deep in conversation. So you're really planning to stay in town for a while? Frank was asking. Ray nodded. The VA could use help with their computer systems. I used to work in IT before. He waved vaguely. Before I decided to hit the road. Figure I can make myself useful while I sort out my dad's affairs. Chuck joined them. Sounds like a good plan. I have you to thank for that, Ray said. You could have handled things very differently. Chuck shook his head. Sometimes people need a second chance, not a hard lesson. Well, this young man's going to join us old-timers for coffee tomorrow, Frank announced. Got some veterans from different wars who meet up at the diner. Think it might do him good to hear some stories. And it might do you good to hear some fresh perspectives, Chuck added with a smile. 3 months later, Chuck Norris returned to the small Texas town for another veterans charity event. After the formal proceedings, he made his way to the Main Street diner, curious to see what had become of Ray and Frank. He spotted them immediately, sitting in Frank's regular booth, deep in conversation over coffee cups and half-eaten pieces of pie. Ray was showing Frank something on a tablet, pointing out features with obvious enthusiasm. Chuck, Frank called out when he spotted him. Get over here and join us. Ray's been helping me set up a website for the Veterans Oral History Project. Ray stood to shake Chuck's hand. Good to see you, sir. You too, Chuck replied, taking in the changes in the younger man. Ray looked healthier, more at peace. The angry edge that had defined him 3 months ago was gone. "Pull up a chair," Frank insisted. "Ray's got news." As Chuck sat down, Ray grinned. "Got accepted to finish my engineering degree at Texas A&M. Evening program so I can keep working at the VA during the day." "That's excellent," Chuck said. "Your father would be proud." "I think he would," Ray agreed. "Found some of his old letters recently. Turns out he was trying to reconnect in his own way. I was just too stubborn to see it." Betsy approached their table with a coffee pot. "The usual for everyone?" "You know it," Frank confirmed. As she poured, Betsy nodded toward the window. "You boys see that?" Outside, a group of motorcycles was pulling up to the diner, but these weren't random bikers. The vests they wore identified them as members of the Veterans Motorcycle Club, a group of former service members who rode together. "New chapter just started up," Ray explained. "They're here to talk about escorting the Memorial Day parade next month." Chuck looked from Ray to Frank and back again, taking in the unlikely friendship that had formed between them. What had begun as an ugly confrontation had transformed into something neither man could have expected. A bridge between generations, between different ways of serving, between the past and the future. "You know," Chuck said as he sipped his coffee, "some people say everything happens for a reason." Frank chuckled. "I don't know about that. But I do know that how we respond to what happens, that's what defines us." Outside, the veterans on motorcycles were being greeted by the diner, regulars like old friends. Inside, 3 men from different walks of life shared coffee and conversation, bound together by an incident that could have ended very differently, if not for the wisdom to look beyond first impressions and the courage to make amends. As Frank launched into one of his Korean War stories, one Ray had clearly heard before but still listened to with genuine interest, Chuck Norris sat back and smiled. Sometimes the best victories weren't the ones that ended with a roundhouse kick, but the ones that ended with understanding, forgiveness, and a second chance. Note: this is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes.